A dog gives birth to 7 puppies, and everything seems normal until the 7th one. Arrives, the vet freezes his face, turning pale as he stares at what just came out. This isn't just any puppy, it's something so rare, so extraordinary that it leaves everyone in the room speechless, but as joy turns to panic, the fragile pup begins to struggle for its life. What made the vet scream in shock, and how? Will this tiny miraculous puppy change everything for its owner? This is a story of heartbreak, resilience, and the kind of miracles you never see coming. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from, or today the autumn chill nipped at Grace's nose as she pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The sun hadn't yet peeked over the horizon, but her internal clock never failed to wake her before dawn. Her breath came out in small misty puffs as she stepped onto the creaky wooden porch of her farmhouse. Luna, her faithful German shepherd, padded silently beside her. Their morning routine, as natural as breathing, the dog's warm presence helped chase away some of the morning cold and the worries that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Morning, everyone, Grace called softly as she made her way to the barn. The sanctuary was peaceful at this hour, with only the gentle sounds of awakening animals breaking the silence. A horse nickered from one of the paddocks. Old Thunder, she knew without looking, the rescued Belgian draft horse, always greeted her first. The chicken coop came alive with quiet clucks as she approached. Yes, yes, breakfast is coming, she assured them with a small smile. Luna sat patiently by the gate, head tilted as she watched Grace go about her morning tasks. As she scattered feed for the chickens, Grace's mind wandered to Robert. He'd loved this place so much. The sanctuary had been his dream long before. They'd made it a reality, a safe haven for animals that needed a second chance at life. She could still see his face lighting up every time they welcomed a new rescue. Robert would know what to do, she whispered to Luna, who pressed against her leg in response. The dog's brown eyes seemed to hold all the understanding in the world. After finishing the morning feeding routine, hay for Thunder and his paddock mate, Daisy fresh vegetables for Rosie the pig, grain for the goats, Grace headed back to the house. Her stomach growled, reminding her she needed breakfast. To the mail from yesterday still sat unopened on her kitchen table. She hadn't had the energy to sort through it after a long day of repairs to the goat pen. Now, as she sipped her coffee, she began going through the stacked bills. As usual, a flyer from the local hardware store, and then her hand trembled as she opened the official-looking envelope. Notice of foreclosure. The words jumped out at her like a physical blow. Grace's coffee cup clattered against its saucer. She read through the document, her heart pounding harder with each line. 3 months behind on payments, property subject to repossession, final notice. No, she breathed, the word catching in her throat. No, no, no. Luna whined softly and rested her head on Grace's lap. The morning sun was rising now, streaming through the kitchen window and casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Grace's hand shook as she set down the notice and buried her fingers in Luna's thick fur. She made her way to the porch, needing air. The sanctuary lay before her, peaceful in the golden morning light. Thunder and Daisy grazed contentedly in their paddock. The chickens scratched in their yard. Rosie, the pig, dozed in her favorite muddy spot. Each of them had come here broken or unwanted, and each had found healing within these fences. Luna settled beside her, a warm, steady presence against her leg. Grace ran her hand over the dog's head, trying to steady her racing thoughts. We'll figure this out, won't we, girl? The evening air grew crisp as Grace made her final rounds at the sanctuary. Moonlight spilled over the barn roofs, casting long shadows across the ground. The horses nickered softly in their stalls, and the chickens had already settled in for the night there. Quiet clucking, barely audible, but something wasn't right. Luna, usually calm during these evening checks, paced back and forth, her nails clicking against the wooden porch. She whined a sound that made Grace's heart squeeze with worry. What's wrong, sweet girl? Grace knelt beside her faithful companion. Luna laid down, then immediately stood up again, her sides heaving with rapid breaths. She circled 3 times before lying down once more, only to repeat the process. Grace's eyes widened as realization dawned. The puppies were Coming, oh Luna, her hands trembled as she reached for her phone without hesitation. She dialed Dr. Caleb Reynolds' number. He answered on the second ring. Dr. Reynolds, it's Grace Lenz, I think. Luna's in labor. Bring her to the clinic right away. Caleb's steady voice replied, I'll meet you there. Grace grabbed Luna's favorite blanket from the porch swing and guided her companion to the old pickup truck. Luna needed help climbing in something that had never happened before. Easy does it, girl, Grace murmured, spreading the blanket across the seat. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as Grace navigated the familiar country roads. Every from Luna made her grip the steering wheel tighter. Memories flooded back. Luna curled up beside her during those first awful nights after Robert died, her warm presence a constant comfort when the world felt cold and empty. We're almost there, sweet girl, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Caleb will take good care of you. The clinic's lights were already on when they pulled into the parking lot. Caleb stood waiting at the door, his face calm and reassuring. He helped Grace guide Luna inside, his gentle hands checking her over as they walked. You're right about the labor, he confirmed, leading them to a prepared area with soft blankets and medical supplies. Everything looks normal so far. Luna's healthy and strong. Grace settled beside Luna, running her fingers through the dog's thick fur. The examination room was quiet except for Luna's labored breathing and the soft tick of the wall clock outside. Crickets chirped their evening song. You're doing so well, Grace whispered to Luna, who rested her head in Grace's lap. Such a brave girl. Caleb moved efficiently around them, checking Luna's vital signs and preparing for the delivery. His presence was steady and calming, just like always. Grace watched him work, grateful for his dedication to the animals in their small town. Luna panted softly in the quiet room, and Grace continued stroking her fur, whispering words of encouragement to her faithful friend. Under the bright clinic lights, Luna's labor intensified. Grace knelt beside her faithful companion, her hands steady on Luna's heaving side. Caleb moved with practiced efficiency, his blue surgical gloves ready as the first puppy emerged. Here we go, Caleb said softly. The first ones coming. One by one, tiny German Shepherd puppies arrived, each bringing fresh waves of joy to Grace's heart. Caleb worked quickly, checking each puppy before placing them in a cozy basket lined with warm blankets. The puppy squirmed and squeaked, their wet fur gradually drying in the warmth of the clinic's 6 healthy puppies. Caleb announced, his voice warm with satisfaction, they're all doing great. But Luna wasn't finished as the 7th puppy emerged. Caleb's sharp intake of breath made Grace's heart skip. Oh my goodness, he whispered carefully, lifting the last puppy. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Grace leaned forward, her eyes widening. The puppy was pure white like freshly fallen snow. Unlike its dark siblings, this tiny creature seemed to glow under the clinic lights. Is something wrong? Grace asked, noting Caleb's amazed expression. This is incredibly rare, Caleb explained, his voice filled with wonder. A pure white German Shepherd. I've only read about them in my studies. Before Grace could respond, the white puppy breathing became labored. Its tiny chest barely moved and its limbs lay limp in Caleb's hands. No, 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 Caleb muttered, springing into action. He quickly moved to the oxygen tank, attaching a small mask. Grace watched her heart in her throat as he worked to save the struggling puppy. The minutes felt like hours. Grace found herself praying, her hand absently stroking Luna's head as they both watched Caleb fight for the tiny puppy's life. Finally, a weak cry pierced the tense silence. There we go, little one, Caleb said, relief evident in his voice. He turned to Grace, his expression serious. The puppy's stable for now, but I need to be honest, the next few hours will be critical. These cases can be touch and go. Grace gazed at the fragile white puppy, now breathing shallow but steady breaths despite its size and delicate condition. She saw something special in its fight for life. I'm going to call him Valor, she declared softly, reaching out to stroke his tiny head with one finger. Because that's exactly what we need right now. Courage, the other puppies nursed contentedly against Luna's warm body, but little Valor needed extra care. Grace cradled him gently in her palms, his tiny form barely bigger than her hand. Looking down at his peaceful face, she made a silent promise to give him every chance at survival. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft pinks and Oranges as Grace's old pickup truck rumbled down the sanctuary's gravel driveway. In the back, nestled in a large padded crate, Luna lay with her 7 puppies. Grace had wrapped them carefully in warm blankets for the journey home. Inside the barn, Grace had spent hours the night before preparing a special corner. Old quilts lined a raised wooden platform, and a heat lamp cast a warm glow over the space. She gently carried the crate inside. The sweet smell of fresh hay filling the air. "Here we are, girl," Grace murmured, helping Luna settle into her new nest. Home sweet home. Throughout the morning, Grace moved between her usual chores and checking on the puppies. Rosie the pig needed her breakfast, and the horses were waiting for their morning feed. But every few minutes her eyes drifted back to the barn, particularly to tiny Valor. The white puppy barely moved except for the slight rise and fall of his chest, his siblings all robust and wiggling pressed against Luna's warm belly. But Valor needed help even to nurse. Grace was positioning Valor closer to Luna when her phone rang. It was Martin Weber, her lawyer. Grace Martin's voice was heavy. "I've got some news you need to hear. Cross Development Group just bought the Johnson farm next door." Grace's hand tightened on the phone. "The whole property, all 100 acres. They're planning something big. Shopping centers, maybe housing developments." "Grace, they might try to pressure you to sell your sanctuary. Could be right in the middle of their plans." The words hit her like a physical blow. First the foreclosure notice, and now this. Grace thanked Mar mechanically and ended the call. Her feet carried her back to the barn. She sank down beside Luna's nest, watching the puppies nurse. Valor's white coat stood out among his darker siblings, his tiny body still fighting for every breath. "Look at you," Grace whispered, gently stroking Valor's head with one finger. "Everyone said you might not make it through the night, but here you are still fighting." Tears welled in her eyes as she watched the tiny puppy's determined efforts to survive. The evening sun cast long shadows through the barn windows. As Grace stepped outside, she looked across her sanctuary. The paddocks were rescued horses grazed, the chicken coop where abandoned hens had found a home, the old maple tree where Robert used to sit and dream about their future. The peaceful scene before her felt precious and fragile. "If Valor can fight, so can I," she whispered to herself. The aroma of fresh coffee filled Grace's small kitchen as sunlight streamed through the worn cotton curtains. She sat at her old oak table with Mary and Helen, both still wearing their morning jackets. Steam rose from their mugs while Grace spread butter on her barely touched toast. "I just don't know what to do," Grace said, her voice trembling. "This development company, they could take everything we've built." Here Mary reached across the table and squeezed Grace's hand. Her silver hair caught the morning light as she leaned forward. "Grace, honey, this sanctuary has helped more animals than we can count. Remember that 3-legged deer we nursed back to health, or those abandoned kittens last winter?" Helen nodded, her round face serious. "And don't forget how many school kids come through here. They learn so much about caring for animals." Grace stood up. "Suddenly, I need to check on Luna and the puppies. Come with me." The 3 women made their way to the barn, their boots crunching on the gravel path. Inside, Luna lay contentedly with her puppies, all of them nursing except for Valor, who dozed separately under the heat lamp. "Look at that little fighter," Helen said softly, getting stronger every day. Back at the kitchen table, Mary pulled out a small notebook from her purse. "We need to let people know what's happening. I think we should organize a town meeting, and I know Sarah at the local paper." Helen added she'd love to write about the sanctuary. "People need to understand what we could lose." Grace stared into her coffee cup. "I don't know, going public with all this. You're not alone in this fight," Mary insisted. "The whole town loves this place." Grace excused herself once more to check on Valor, kneeling beside the tiny white puppy. She gently stroked his head. "You've already fought so hard," she whispered. "I won't let them take this place away." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary grounds as Dr. Caleb Reynolds's pickup truck rolled to a stop by the front gate, pushed it open with a weary smile, her cardigan wrapped tight against the autumn chill. "Thanks for coming, Caleb. I know you're busy." "Never too busy for my favorite patients," he said, grabbing his medical bag. He paused, taking in the peaceful scene, chickens scratching in the dirt, horses grazing in the distance. "You know, despite everything, there's something special about this place. It has a certain magic to it." "In the barn, Luna wagged her tail at their approach. Her 6 healthy puppies squirmed and tumbled around her, letting out tiny squeaks and yips. Caleb knelt beside them, checking each one thoroughly. "They're doing wonderfully," he said, gently examining each wiggling puppy's strong appetites. Good weight gain. When he reached for Valor, Grace held her breath. The white puppy lay quietly under the heat lamp, watching them with alert eyes. Caleb's hands were gentle as he listened to Valor's chest and checked his vitals. "Well, look at you," he murmured, genuine surprise in his voice. "His breathing's much better than I expected. He's still fragile," but Caleb smiled up at Grace. "He's quite the fighter, really." Grace knelt beside him, hope blooming in her chest. "See how calm he is," Caleb pointed out. "Most this age are all squirms and squeaks, but he's so peaceful. It's remarkable." Grace twisted her hands together. "I wish everything else was going as well. The development company that bought the adjacent land, they might force us out." Caleb carefully placed Valor back under the lamp. "I heard rumors about that. Listen, if there's anything I can do to help, letters of support, professional testimony about the sanctuaries. Importance, just say the word. That's kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose." Grace, he interrupted gently, "This place matters to the animals, to the community, to me. We'll figure it out." He nodded toward Valor. "One step at a time. Even the smallest signs of life mean there's hope." Grace walked Caleb back to his truck, thanking him again. As he drove away, she stood by the barn entrance, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky blazed orange and pink, painting the sanctuary in warm light. Caleb's words echoed in her mind, and she felt a flutter of determination take root in her chest. The next morning dawned clear and crisp as Grace spread her homemade flyers across the kitchen table. Mary sat beside her, armed with a stapler and tape. "These look good," Mary said, holding up one of the flyers. "Simple, but eye-catching." Grace nodded, gathering a stack in her arms. "I hope they work. We need all the support we can get." Throughout the morning, Grace made her way through town, her footsteps echoing on the sidewalk as she posted flyers everywhere she could. The bell above Martha's diner chimed as she entered, and old Joe at the hardware store gave her a sympathetic smile when she explained her cause at the Lee Lyery. Mrs. Peterson immediately offered to create a special display by late afternoon. Grace's feet ached as she returned to the sanctuary. Helen was already there, pushing folding chairs into neat rows in the community room, a modest space they usually use for volunteer orientations. "I brought some extra cookies," Helen said, arranging photos of rescued animals on a card table, "and coffee. People always stay longer when there's coffee." As the sun began to set, cars started pulling into the gravel parking area. Grace's heart sank a bit as she counted them, only 8 vehicles in total. She forced a smile as people filed in, taking seats scattered throughout the room. During her presentation, Grace's voice grew stronger as she shared stories about the animals they'd helped. She told them about Shadow, the horse who'd arrived so scared he wouldn't let anyone touch him and now gave rid to children. About Ruby, the 3-legged goat who'd become the sanctuary's unofficial greeter. "This place isn't just about animals," Grace explained, her hands clasped together. "It's about second chances. It's about healing." She scanned the faces before her, searching for signs of understanding. Near the end, a small boy in the back raised his hand. "Can we see the white puppy? My mom said there was a special white puppy." Grace's spirits lifted slightly. "Of course, would you all like to meet Valor?" The group followed her to the barn, where Luna watched protectively over her litter. Valor lay quietly among his siblings, his white coat gleaming in the barn's soft lighting. "He's so pretty," the boy whispered, kneeling beside the pen. His parents joined him, clearly captivated by the unusual puppy. Other attendees gathered around, asking questions about Valor's rare coloring and commenting on his peaceful demeanor. Even Mr. Thompson, who'd looked half asleep during the presentation, leaned in for a better look as people began heading home. Grace stood by the barn door, thanking each person for coming. The turnout hadn't been what she'd hoped for, but watching that little boy's face light up at the sight of Valor had sparked something inside her. Sometimes the smallest moments could make the biggest difference. The next morning, Grace woke before sunrise, her boots crunching on the frosty ground as she made her way to the barn, the familiar sense of hay and feed. The following morning, Grace's phone rang just as she finished feeding the Chicken's the unfamiliar number made her pause before answering Mrs. Lenz. This is Sam Whitaker from the Willow Creek Gazette. A friendly voice said, Mrs. Blake told me about your sanctuary and especially about a remarkable white German shepherd puppy. Grace leaned against the fence, her free hand absently stroking Luna, who had padded up beside her. Yes, that's Valor. I'd love to write a feature story about him in the sanctuary. Would it be possible to visit today? Grace hesitated, thinking of all the morning chores still waiting. But then she remembered Mary's words about needing exposure. Yes, that would be fine. How about mid-morning? Sam arrived promptly at 10, his weathered camera hanging from his neck, and a worn notebook tucked under his arm. His easy smile and genuine interest in the animals put Grace at ease as she led him around the sanctuary. This is where we rehabilitate injured horses, Grace explained, gesturing to the paddock where Starfire grazed. Peace. Why, and over there, that's Rosie's pen. She was rescued from a neglectful situation. Sam scribbled notes, asking thoughtful questions about each animal's story. When they reached the barn, his eyes widened at the sight of Valor's pure white coat among his darker siblings. Extraordinary, he murmured, crouching down to observe the puppy. I've never seen anything like him. Grace shared the story of Valor's difficult birth and his surprising effect on the other animals. Right on cue, Valor wobbled over to Starfire's paddock, and they watched as the usually skittish horse lowered his head to nuzzle the tiny puppy. That's incredible, Sam said, snapping photos, and all this could be lost to corporate development. Grace's throat tightened as she explained about cross-development group and the foreclosure. Notice Sam's pen moved rapidly across his notepad. While they talked, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. A couple with 2 young children stepped out, saying they'd heard about Valor from friends at church. Would you mind if I interview them too? Sam asked. It shows how word is spreading. As the morning wore on, 2 more groups of visitors arrived, each drawn by stories of the remarkable white puppy. When Sam finally packed up his camera, he turned to Grace with determination in his eyes. This will be in Sunday's paper. People need to know what's at stake here. The autumn breeze rustled through the changing leaves as Grace filled the water troughs. The rhythmic splashing was interrupted by the crunch of tires on gravel. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the sanctuary's entrance, looking oddly out of place among the worn wooden fences and weathered barn. A tall woman in an expensive charcoal suit stepped out, her heels clicking against the ground. Grace's stomach tightened as she watched the stranger approach with calculated steps. Mrs. Lenz, the woman's voice was crisp and professional. I'm Regina Cross from Cross Development Group. Grace wiped her hands on her jeans and nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. Yes, that's me. I'll be direct, Regina said, glancing around with barely concealed distaste. We're beginning construction on the adjacent property. In 2 months, your establishment presents some logistical challenges for our plans. Grace's heart pounded. This sanctuary has been here for 15 years. We serve the community. These animals need us. I understand your attachment, Regina replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. But this development will bring hundreds of jobs to Willow Creek. Progress is inevitable, Mrs. Lenz. The animals here have nowhere else to go, Grace insisted, gesturing to the paddocks where rescued horses grazed peacefully. Each one has a story, a reason they're here. Regina's expression remained unmoved. Perhaps you should consider selling. It would make things simpler for everyone involved. The threat in her words was subtle but clear. This sanctuary isn't for sale, Grace said firmly, despite the tremor in her voice. My husband and I built this place to give these animals a second chance. That's not something I'm willing to give up. Admirable, Regina said coolly, but ultimately impractical. I suggest you think carefully about your position. She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, leaving Grace standing in the dust. As the black Mercedes disappeared down the road, Grace's shoulders slumped. She made her way to the porch, where Luna lay with her puppies. Valor's white coat stood out among his siblings as he snuggled close to his mother. Grace sat down beside them, running her fingers through Luna's fur. They don't know how strong we are, she whispered to Valor. We'll fight this together. The crisp morning air held promise as Grace, Mary, and Helen bustled around the sanctuary, setting up folding tables and hanging colorful banners. The smell of fresh baked cookies and muffins drifted from Mary's table, while Helen arranged photos of rescued animals along the tour route. Everything looks wonderful, Grace said, adjusting a Meet Valor sign near the barn entrance. Her heart fluttered with nervous energy as the clock struck 10. They waited eagerly for visitors. The first hour passed slowly, with just two families wandering in. Mary's cheerful voice carried across the grounds as she offered samples of her famous apple bread, while Helen animated her tour with stories of each animal's rescue. Grace sat on a hay bale near Luna's pen, Valor cradled gently in her arms. The tiny, white puppy remained calm, despite the occasional excited squeals from children. A little girl in pigtails and a pink dress approached timidly. "Can I pet him?" she whispered, eyes wide with wonder. "Of course, sweetheart. Just be very gentle." Grace smiled as the girl stroked Valor's soft fur. "Is he a magic puppy?" the girl asked. "Suddenly, he's so white and pretty, like in fairy tales." Grace's heartwarming concern about the turnout. "He is pretty special, isn't he?" Throughout the day, similar moments brightened the otherwise quiet event. By mid-afternoon, Grace counted the donation jar while Mary and Helen cleaned up nearby. "What about one of those online fundraising things?" Helen suggested to Mary. "My niece raised money for a cat surgery. That way we could make a video about Valor." Mary added, "People love special animals." Grace stared at the modest pile of bills and checks in front of her. The amount wouldn't even cover next month's feed bill, let alone help with the mortgage. Still, she felt grateful for every dollar given and every person who'd shown up to support them. As the sun began to set, Grace folded the last chair and carried it to the storage shed. The grounds were quiet again, save for the usual animal sound. She found Valor snuggled against Luna, peaceful and serene, kneeling beside them. She gently scratched behind Valor's ears. "You're my little miracle," she whispered. "We'll find a way." The next morning dawned cold and gray. Grace noticed something was wrong the moment she entered the barn for her usual check on Luna and her puppies. While the other puppies tumbled and played, Valor lay quietly in the corner, his small white form barely moving. "Hey, little one," Grace whispered, reaching down to stroke his fur. Her heart sank when he didn't respond to her touch like usual. When she offered him food, he turned his head away with trembling fingers. Grace dialed Caleb's number. "Something's wrong with Valor," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He won't eat, and he's so quiet." Caleb arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside Valor, his experienced hands gentle as he examined the tiny puppy. Grace watched anxiously as he listened to Val's chest and checked his temperature. "He has a respiratory infection," Caleb finally said, his face serious. "It's treatable, but the medication he needs is expensive given everything else you're dealing with." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "You might need to think about your priorities right now." Grace felt her throat tighten. How much? When Caleb named the price, her heart sank. It was money she desperately needed for the sanctuary's bills. "I'll try to get it at a discount," Caleb offered, his voice kind. "I have some contacts who might help." After Caleb left, Grace sat in the barn beside Luna and Valor. She stroked the puppy's white fur, noticing how his breathing seemed more labored than before. "Don't give up," she whispered, her voice catching. "You fought so hard already." As evening approached, Grace made two phone calls. Mary answered first, then Helen joined on speakerphone. "I need your help," Grace said, explaining Valor's condition and Caleb's diagnosis. "I was thinking maybe we could try one of those online fundraising things you mentioned." "Of course, Mary," exclaimed Helen, "and I can help set it up tonight. We'll spread the word everywhere." Helen added firmly, social media, email, everything. For the first time that day, Grace felt a small spark of hope. She looked down at Valor, who had finally drifted off to sleep. "Thank you," she said softly to her friends. "I don't know what I'd do without you both." The next morning's weak sunlight filtered through Grace's kitchen window, casting a gentle glow over the scattered papers and open laptop on her table. Mary and Helen sat with her, their coffee cups steaming in the chilly air. "We need to tell Valor's story in a way that touches people's hearts," Mary said, sorting through a stack of sanctuary photos. Helen leaned forward, her fingers moving swiftly across the laptop keyboard. "These crowdfunding sites are pretty straightforward. We just need to set up an account and share your story." Grace wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, drawing comfort from its warmth. "I just hope it's enough. The medication costs are so high, and with everything else, let's focus on one thing at a time." Helen said, "Kindly first we'll write about Valor, his special birth, how he's touched everyone." Who's met him? Mary held up a photo of Valor nestled against Luna. "Look at this one. You can really see how unique his white coat is." They spent the next hour crafting the perfect message. Grace's voice cracked several times as she recorded a video message in the barn. Valor cradled gently in her arms. "Hi, I'm Grace Lenz," she said to the camera. "This is Valor, our miracle puppy. He was born different, special, and now he needs your help." She went on to explain the sanctuary's mission and their current struggles. By early afternoon, Helen had uploaded everything to the crowdfunding site. "It's ready," she announced, turning the laptop so Grace could see. "Should I hit publish?" Grace took a deep breath and nodded. The moment Helen clicked the button, Grace felt her heart skip a beat. They watched as the first donation came in, just $20 from someone named Sarah. Then another $5, then $50. "Look," Mary pointed at the screen. "People are sharing it already." Helen smiled, pulling out her phone. "I'll post it on all my social media accounts. The more people who see it, the better." "I know some teachers at the elementary school," Mary added. "They might be interested in sharing this with their students." Families. As the sun began to set, Grace made her way to the barn. Valor lay curled up in his usual spot, his tiny white form a beacon in the dimness. She sat beside him, and he immediately snuggled against her leg. "People are rooting for you, little one," she whispered, gently stroking his fur. "We'll get through this together." The morning sun had barely cleared the treetops when Grace heard the crunch of tires on gravel. She paused, a bucket of feed in her hands, and watched several unfamiliar cars pulling into the sanctuary's driveway. "Hello," she called out cautiously, setting down the bucket. A group of people emerged from their vehicles, smiling warmly. A tall woman with silver streak hair stepped forward. "Are you Grace? We saw your crowdfunding campaign about Valor in the sanctuary. We're here to help." Grace's heart skipped a beat. You all came because of the campaign?" "Sure did," said a burly man in well-worn work clothes, introducing himself as Mr. Holston. "I'm a retired carpenter. Notice that barn roof could use some attention." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. "I don't know what to say. Thank you." Within minutes, the sanctuary buzzed with activity. Grace directed volunteers to different tasks, some mending fences, others cleaning pens and organizing supplies. Mr. Holston immediately got to work on the barn roof, refusing any payment. "My daughter's therapy horse changed her life," one volunteer shared while scrubbing water troughs. "When I read about what you're doing here, I knew I had to help." Throughout the day, the sanctuary transformed. Fresh paint brightened the fences, clean straw filled the stalls, and even Starfire stood quietly for grooming, something that usually required endless patience. "It's like he knows we're here to help," remarked the volunteer, brushing him. A young couple working on organizing supplies told Grace how Valor's story had given them hope during their own difficult times. "If that tiny puppy could fight so hard, so can we," the woman said, wiping sweat from her forehead as the afternoon faded into evening. Grace stood at the gate watching the volunteers pack up their tools. Her heart felt full as she waved goodbye to each car. The sanctuary looking more loved and cared for than it had in months. Thank you all so much," she called out, her voice thick with emotion. She stayed at the gate until the last highlights disappeared down the road, overwhelmed by the knowledge that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. The morning sun filtered through the barn windows as Grace checked on Luna and her puppies. The mother dog lay contentedly while her litter nursed all except Valor, who was curled up in a small ball nearby. Grace gently stroked his white fur, noting with relief that his breathing seemed stronger today. The sound of tires on gravel made her look up through the barn door. She spotted a gleaming black car pulling into the sanctuary's driveway. Her stomach tightened as Regina Cross stepped out, looking pristine in her tailored business suit. "Mrs. Lenz," Regina called out, her heels clicking against the ground. "I need to inspect the property today." Grace straightened her worn jeans and work shirt, suddenly conscious of how shabby she must look. "What exactly are you inspecting?" "Potential issues that might affect our construction plans." Regina's tone was crisp and professional. "The proximity of your animal's noise levels, that sort of thing." Grace nodded reluctantly. "I'll walk with you." They made their way around the sanctuary, Regina making notes on her tablet while Grace watched nervously. The developer showed Little interest in the rescued horses or the happy chickens scratching in their pen when they reached the barn. Grace held her breath. This was where she kept the most vulnerable animals, including Luna and her puppies. To her surprise, a small white shape wobbled toward them. Valor, usually shy with strangers, approached Regina with his characteristic calm demeanor. He sat at her feet, looking up with gentle eyes. Something shifted in Regina's expression. She hesitated, then knelt down, her expensive suit touching the barn floor. "Well, hello there," she said softly, reaching out to stroke Valor's head. "That's Valor," Grace explained, seizing the moment. "He was born here just a few weeks ago, the runt of the litter, and we weren't sure he'd make it." Regina's fingers moved gently over Valor's ears. "What's wrong with him? He has some respiratory issues, but he's a fighter." Grace watched as Valor leaned into Regina's touch. "We're raising money for his treatment, the sanctuary. It gives animals like him a second chance." Regina listened as Grace shared stories about the animals they'd saved. Her usual business-like demeanor softening slightly. She didn't interrupt or check her phone. Once finally Regina stood smoothing her suit, she glanced down at Valor one last time, something unreadable crossing her face. "He really is something special," she murmured before turning to leave. Grace stood in the barn doorway, watching the black car disappear down the driveway, looking down at Valor beside her. She whispered, "You might be stronger than we all realize." A few days later, dark clouds rolled over Willow Creek like a heavy blanket. Grace stood in the sanctuary's yard, watching the threatening sky. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees and making the old barn doors creak. "Grace," Mary called out, hurrying up the driveway with Helen close behind. They carried armfuls of tarps and supplies. "We heard about the storm warning on the radio. Thank goodness you're here," Grace said, helping them unload. "We need to secure everything before it hits." They worked quickly, moving hay bales to higher ground and checking that all water barrels were properly covered. The horses stomped nervously in their stalls as thunder rumbled in the distance. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall. As they finished securing the chicken coop, wind whipped around them, growing stronger by the minute. A loud crack from the barn made them all jump. "The roof," Grace shouted over the howling wind. Part Mr. Hahn's repair work had come loose, leaving a gap where rain poured, and we need to move the animals," Helen yelled, already heading for the barn doors. Grace rushed to Luna and her puppies first, but stopped short when she saw Valor. The tiny white puppy was on his feet, moving with surprising strength toward a group of confused goats. He gave a small bark, and to Grace's amazement, the goats began following him toward the main building. "Would you look at that?" Mary breathed, pausing despite the chaos inspired by Valor's determination. They worked tirelessly through the storm. Rain soaked through their clothes as they guided each animal to safety. The wind screamed and tore at the buildings, but they didn't stop until every creature was secured. They spent the night in the main building with the animals, listening to the storm rage outside. Grace held Valor close, drawing comfort from his steady presence. The walls shook with each thunderclap, but somehow the little puppy remained calm. When morning finally came, the storm had passed. Grace stepped outside, her boots squelching in the mud. The sanctuary was a mess, fallen branches everywhere, the barn roof partially caved in, and the driveway blocked by a fallen oak tree. But as she surveyed, paid the damage, Valor limped to her side and sat quietly. Grace looked down at him, then back at the sanctuary. It was battered, but like Valor, it was still standing. Mary and Helen joined her, their faces tired but determined. "All the animals made it," Helen said softly. "Not a single one hurt." "That's something to be thankful for," Mary added, though her eyes were fixed on the damaged barn. Grace nodded, feeling overwhelmed by the work ahead, but grateful for the small victories. The cool morning air filled her lungs as she took in the scene before her. The sanctuary damaged but undefeated. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sanctuary, revealing the storm's aftermath. Grace stood on her porch, coffee mug warming her hands as she surveyed the scattered branches and debris. The old barn had taken the worst hit, its roof partially torn away on one side. "Oh, Grace," Mary called out, climbing out of her truck with Helen. Both women wore work gloves and carried rakes. "We came as soon as we could." Grace managed a tired smile. "I appreciate it. I hardly slept thinking About the mess, we'd find her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Tom Harper, her lawyer. Grace, I think I found something, he said, his voice excited. If we can prove the sanctuary has cultural or environmental significance, we might be able to block cross-development's plans. Grace's heart quickened. Really? How? Historical landmarks and environmentally protected areas are much harder to develop around if we can document the sanctuary's importance to the community and environment. We might have a case. After hanging up, Grace gathered Mary and Helen in the sanctuary's small community room. Valor lay curled up in a patch of sunlight while they brainstormed the sacred grove. Helen exclaimed suddenly, my grandmother used to tell stories about how the town's first settlers would gather there for important meetings. Those trees must be over 200 years old. Mary nodded eagerly. And remember last spring we had those bird watchers spot that rare warbler nesting in those trees? They were beside themselves with excitement. Grace started making notes, her energy building. We should contact the Historical Society and maybe that environmental group that did the wildlife survey last year. They spent the afternoon gathering evidence. Grace dug through old photos while Mary called longtime residents for statements about the sanctuary's impact on their lives. Helen researched local history, finding mentions of the grove and century-old town records. Valor watched them work, his calm presence seeming to energize everyone. When Grace felt overwhelmed by the task ahead, she'd look at the tiny white puppy and remember why they were fighting so hard. As evening approached, the three friends sat beneath the ancient trees of the sacred grove. The setting sun filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the ground around them. Grace touched the rough bark of the nearest tree, thinking of Robert and how much he had loved this place. Thank you both, she said softly to her friends. I couldn't do this without you. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the golden light fade while crickets began their evening song. Grace felt stronger than she had in days, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. 2 days later, Grace knelt in the barn's fresh hay, checking on Luna's puppies. The morning light filtered through the damaged roof, creating scattered patterns on the floor. She heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked up to see Regina cross his black car, pulling in. Regina stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the muddy ground. She looked as polished as ever in her navy business suit, but something was different about her today. Her usual sharp edges seemed softer, somehow quite a mess the storm left, Regina said, glancing at the barn's damaged roof. Gray straightened up, brushing hay from her jeans weave. Weathered worse, this sanctuary is stronger than it looks. Is it? Regina raised an eyebrow. From where I stand, it's barely holding together, like Valor. Grace said firmly. Everyone thought he wouldn't make it, but here he is proving them wrong every day. As if on cue, Valor padded over to Regina, his white coat gleaming in the sunlight. Regina's professional math slipped for a moment as she looked down at him. After a slight hesitation, Regina knelt, her expensive suit touching the barn floor. How is he doing? Getting stronger every day, Grace said, watching as Valor gently nuzzled Regina's hand, just like the kids who come here for therapy. There was this one boy, Tommy. He wouldn't speak to anyone after losing his father, but after a few weeks with our rescue horse Starfire, he started opening up. Regina's hand stilled on Valor's fur. I had a dog once, she said quietly. When I was 12, my parents were going through a divorce, and Rex, he was the only one who seemed to understand. Grace held her breath, sensing the rare moment of vulnerability. The sanctuary isn't just about animals, Grace said softly. It's about healing for everyone who comes here. Regina stood up slowly, brushing off her suit. Her professional demeanor returned, but her eyes remained on Valor. She walked toward her car, then paused at the barn door. He's special, she said, looking back at Valor. Don't lose that. Grace watched Regina's car disappear down the driveway, her heart beating with a mixture of hope and worry. The morning sun caught Valor's white coat, making him glow like a tiny beacon in the weathered old barn. The next morning, Grace sat at her kitchen table sipping coffee while checking the crowdfunding campaign on her laptop. Her eyes widened as she saw the numbers. The donation total had jumped overnight from a few thousand to over $20,000. Her phone rang, and Helen's excited voice burst through the speaker. Grace, have you seen it? The campaign's gone viral. Sam's article got picked up by major news outlets and people are sharing Valor's story. Everywhere, Grace's hands trembled as she refreshed the page. I can't believe it. Helen, this could change everything without wasting time. Grace called Dr. Caleb to order Valor's medication for the first time in weeks. She didn't have to worry about choosing between the puppy's treatment and the sanctuary's basic needs. Throughout the day, cars streamed into the sanctuary. Volunteers, both familiar and new, arrived with tools and supplies. Mr. Hahn climbed onto the barn roof, methodically replacing damaged shingles and reinforcing weak spots. The sound of his hammer rang out like a heartbeat of renewal. Ma'am, a man in work boots approached. Grace, I'm Dan from Green Valley Landscaping. Heard about your fallen trees. We'd like to help clear them. No charge. Grace watched in amazement as the landscaping crew carefully removed the fallen trees around the sacred grove, preserving its dignity while making it safer. In the afternoon, Mary arrived with a stack of mail. You need to see these, she said, handing Grace several letters. Grace sat on the porch swing, reading letter after letter. One in particular caught her attention. Dear Grace, 3 years ago, I visited your sanctuary during the darkest period of my life. Something about the peaceful atmosphere and the rescued animals helped me find hope again. I've been following Valor's story, and once again, your sanctuary is providing light in the darkness. Please don't give up. These stories are powerful, Mary said, sorting through more letters. They show how much impact this place has had. We should use them to prove the sanctuary's importance to the community. That evening, Grace walked into the barn where Valor lay curled up next to Luna. His breathing seemed easier, and he lifted his head at her approach, his eyes bright and alert. The medication was already making a difference. You've done more than I ever imagined, little one, Grace whispered, gently stroking his white fur. The autumn sun cast long shadows through the sacred grove as Grace adjusted the microphone stand around her. Dozens of supporters gathered, holding handmade signs with messages like Save Our Sanctuary and Protect Willow Creek's heritage. The ancient trees towered above them, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Thank you all for coming, Grace began, her voice steady despite her nerves. This grove has been part of our town's story for generations. My late husband Robert used to tell me how his grandfather would bring injured animals here, believing the land itself had healing powers. As she spoke, more people arrived, swelling the crowd beyond her expectations. She spotted familiar faces, Mary and Helen, near the front, Mr. Helston with his Carpenters Union friends, and Mrs. Blake surrounded by her former students. This sanctuary isn't just about saving animals, Grace continued. It's about preserving our community's heart. Every rescued horse, every rehabilitated dog, every child who finds comfort here. They're all part of something bigger than our elves. Local news vans pulled up there. Crew setting up cameras. Sam Whitaker stood among them, notebook in hand. Smiling encouragingly, Valor sat quietly beside Grace, his white coat gleaming in the sunlight. The crowd's attention suddenly shifted as Regina Cross's black car rolled to a stop. She stepped out, looking uncomfortable but determined, and stood at the edge of the gathering. People whispered and pointed, but Grace kept speaking, sharing stories of the sanctuary's impact. Last month, we helped a veteran with PTSD find peace working with our rescue horses, she said. Last week, a group of special needs children connected with our gentlest animals in ways that brought their parents to tears. As if on cue, Valor stood up and made his way through the crowd. People parted to let him pass, watching in amazing as he approached Regina without hesitation. The tiny white puppy sat at her feet and rested his head on her knee. Regina's professional mask slipped for a moment as she knelt down. Her hand trembled slightly as she stroked Valor's head. Miss Lenz, Regina called out, her voice carrying across the grove. How many families benefit from your programs annually? Grace met her eyes. Over 200. Last year alone, we offer free animal therapy sessions, educational programs for schools and support groups for people dealing with grief and trauma. In this grove, what makes it so special? Regina's questions seemed genuine, not challenging. These trees have witnessed our town's history for centuries, Grace replied passionately. They've provided shelter, healing, and hope, just like the Sanctuary, they remind us that some things are worth more than money. Regina stood quietly looking from the trees to the crowd to Valor, who hadn't left her side. Her expression was unreadable, but her usual confidence seemed shaken. Without another word, she turned and walked back to her car. Grace watched her drive away while Valor returned to sit beside her, his calm presence a reminder that sometimes the smallest beings could make the biggest impact. The morning sunlight filtered through Grace's kitchen window as she spread documents across her dining table. Mary and Helen arrived early, carrying boxes of old photographs and newspaper clippings. Volunteers trickled in, armed with laptops and notebooks, ready to help build their case. Let's organize this by category, Grace suggested, creating separate piles: historical significance, environmental impact, and community testimonials. The phone rang. It was Martha Jenkins from the Historical Society. Grace, we found something remarkable. Martha exclaimed. Photos from 1892 showing town meetings held under that grove. There are journal entries too, describing it as sacred ground for both settlers and Native Americans. Grace's hands trembled as she accepted the precious due documents. Later that morning, the sepia-toned photographs showed people gathered beneath the same ancient trees that still stood today. A knock at the door revealed Caleb, clutching a thick folder. You won't believe what I found, he said, spreading out his research. That grove hosts a nesting pair of red-crowned woodpeckers. They're incredibly rare in this region. I've documented their habitat patterns and can present this to the council. Throughout the afternoon, volunteers worked in focus groups. Some digitized old photographs while others transcribed handwritten testimonials from community members. Mary coordinated with local media outlets, gathering news coverage of the sanctuary's impact over the years. Grace Helen called from her laptop. The University of Eastern Wildlife Studies is interested in our sanctuary. They want to establish a research partnership to study our ecosystem. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as Grace reviewed their progress. They had assembled a compelling case: historical records proving the grove's cultural significance, environmental studies highlighting its unique ecosystem, and heartfelt testimonials about the sanctuary's impact on countless lives. Videos of Valor's remarkable journey and his effect on visitors added a powerful emotional element to their presentation. His story had become intertwined with the sanctuary's fight for survival. As night settled over the sanctuary, Grace stood beneath the ancient trees, cradling Valor against her chest. The tiny white puppy nuzzled her neck as she whispered, "We've done everything we can. The rest is in their hands now." The morning of the town hall meeting dawned crisp and clear. Grace's hands shook as she buttoned her cardigan, her reflection in the mirror showing dark circles under her eyes from nights of preparation. She gathered her documents, double-checking every page while Valor watched from his bed near the window at the community center. Familiar faces filled the rows of chairs. Local farmers sat beside business owners, retired teachers next to young families. The air felt thick with anticipation. Grace took her place at the front with Mary, Helen, and Caleb beside her, their presence steadying her nerves. When Grace approached the podium, her throat tightened. She looked down at her notes, then out at the crowd. This sanctuary, she began, her voice quavering, isn't just about animals, it's about hope. As she spoke about Robert's dream and the countless lives touched by the sanctuary, her confidence grew. She shared stories of troubled teens finding purpose while volunteering, of elderly visitors finding comfort among the animals, of families healing through their connection with nature. Caleb stepped up next, his professional demeanor commanding attention. He presented maps, photographs, and research data about the red-crowned woodpeckers. His clear, factual delivery made the environmental significance impossible to ignore. Gina Cross took her turn at the podium. Immaculate in her business suit, she spoke about jobs, economic growth, and progress, but something was different today. Her usual sharp confidence seemed dulled mid-sentence. She paused, her eyes finding Valor, sitting quietly beside Grace. Regina's voice softened. When I was 12, my parents divorced. I felt lost, alone, but I had a dog named Scout. She swallowed hard. Scout was my anchor during those dark days. I'd forgotten that until she gestured toward Valor, until I saw how this special puppy affects everyone around in the room. Held its breath as Regina straightened her shoulders. I'm proposing a compromise. Cross-development group can modify our plans. We can preserve the grove support the sanctuary and still create sustainable development that benefits everyone. The council chamber erupted in applause and excited chatter when the council voted to grant the sanctuary protected status. Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she hugged Mary Helen and Caleb through it all. Valor sat beside her, offering a single soft bark of approval. The morning sun painted long shadows across the sanctuary as Regina's car pulled up the gravel driveway. Grace watched from the porch, surprised to see the developer's usual stern expression replaced with a gentle smile. Even her clothing seemed more relaxed, a simple sweater instead of her typical business suit. "Good morning, Grace," Regina called out, carrying a thick folder under her arm. "I hope I'm not too early." "Not at all," Grace replied, still adjusting to this softer version of Regina. "Would you like some coffee?" Inside Grace's modest kitchen, Regina spread out several documents on the worn wooden table. "We've revised our development plans," she explained, pointing to a detailed map. "Cross-development group will establish a trust fund using 10% of our annual profits to support the sanctuary's operations." Grace studied the papers carefully, and the grove protected permanently. Regina assured her we'll actually create a buffer zone around it. Our environmental team is excited about incorporating it into the project as a natural preserve. They walked the sanctuary grounds together, Regina's designer boots collecting mud as they went at the horse paddock. She listened intently as Grace shared Starfire's rescue story. The once nervous horse approached the fence, nickering softly. "Each animal here has a similar story," Grace explained. "They just needed someone to believe in them." Valor trotted alongside them, occasionally brushing against Regina's legs. She reached down to scratch behind his ears, her professional facade melting completely. "I need everything in writing," Grace said firmly. "Legal protection for the sanctuary, the grove, and the animals." Regina nodded. "Of course, our lawyers will draft comprehensive agreements. You'll have full review rights, and we'll establish regular check-ins to ensure transparency." Under the sacred grove's canopy, both women paused. Sunlight filtered through the ancient branches, creating dancing patterns on the ground. "I never expected this outcome," Regina admitted, watching Valor explore nearby. "When I first came here, I saw obstacles to progress. Now I see opportunities for both of us to succeed." "Valor helped you see that, didn't he?" Grace asked softly. Regina smiled, kneeling to pet the white puppy. "He has a way of reaching past all the barriers we put up." As Regina prepared to leave, she turned to Grace. "We'll have the paperwork ready by next week. This is going to work, Grace. I promise." Grace stood at the gate, Valor at her feet, watching Regina's car disappear down the road. She looked down at the small white puppy and whispered, "What you did it, little one. You brought us all together." Weeks had passed, and the sanctuary hummed with new life. The crisp autumn air carried the sound of hammering and cheerful chatter as volunteers worked on various improvement projects. A group of bird watchers huddled near the sacred grove, their binoculars trained on a rare species nesting in the ancient trees. Grace walked through the grounds, clipboard in hand, marring at the transformation. The old barn sported a fresh coat of paint, and new fencing gleamed in the morning light. Mr. Holston had even built additional shelters for the growing number of rescued animals. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. Opening it, Grace gasped. The grant application she'd submitted months ago had been approved. The substantial funding would allow her to expand the sanctuary's rehabilitation program and educational initiatives near the main building. Caleb was setting up for his monthly veterinary workshop. A small crowd had already gathered, eager to learn about basic animal care. "We're thinking about adding weekly nature walks through the grove," he told Grace with enthusiasm. "People can't get enough of this place." Visitors from neighboring towns wandered the grounds, many drawn by word of mouth about the sanctuary's remarkable story. A young family stopped to take photos with Valor, who sat regally beside the new welcome sign. Though still smaller than his siblings, he had grown stronger, his white coat gleaming as he patiently posed with admirers. The additional donations had allowed Grace to hire 2 full-time staff members, giving her more time to focus on expanding the sanctuary's reach. She watched as one of them, Sarah, expertly led a therapy session with Starfire and a group of special needs Children Valor trotted alongside Grace as she made her rounds occasionally, stopping to greet visitors with his characteristic gentle demeanor. Everyone who met him seemed touched by his calm presence and remarkable story. As the day drew to a close, Grace settled in her favorite rocking chair on the porch. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grounds where volunteers and visitors mingled, sharing stories and laughter. Valor curled up at her feet, and she could hear Luna playing with her other puppies in the nearby pen. Looking out over the thriving sanctuary, Grace felt tears of gratitude well up in her eyes. Robert's dream hadn't just survived, it had blossomed into something even more beautiful than she could have imagined. The evenings settled over Willow Creek like a soft blanket, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink. Grace walked along the sanctuary's winding paths, her footsteps slow and measured beside her. Valor matched her pace perfectly, his white coat catching the golden light of sunset. The gentle breeze carried the familiar sounds of the sanctuary, horses nickering in their paddocks, chickens settling in for the night, and the distant laughter of volunteers finishing their evening task. Grace paused to scratch behind Valor's ears, smiling at how far they'd both come. Her mind drifted back to that nerve-wracking night at Caleb's clinic. When Valor had entered the world so tiny and fragile, she remembered the fear that had gripped her heart as he struggled to breathe, and the fierce determination that had driven her to fight for his survival. The memory of the foreclosure notice still made her chest tighten, but now it felt like a distant storm that had passed. She thought of Regina's first visit, so cold and businesslike, and marveled at how Valor had somehow reached past that corporate exterior to touch her heart, making her way to the sacred grove. Grace settled on a weathered bench beneath the ancient trees. Valor sat beside her, his presence steady and calming. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves created dancing patterns on the ground. Robert would have loved this, she whispered, feeling closer to him here than anywhere else. She could almost imagine his proud smile, seeing how their shared dream had not only survived but flourished beyond anything they'd imagined. The town hall meeting flashed through her mind, the tension in the room, the passionate speeches, and that remarkable moment when Regina's human had shone through all because of a tiny white puppy who refused to give up. Valor leaned against her leg, his eyes wise and gentle. He'd grown from that struggling newborn into the sanctuary's heart and soul, touching lives in ways Grace never could have predicted. Like the sanctuary itself, he had overcome every obstacle, growing stronger with each challenge. The F-stars began to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling through the grove's canopy around them. The sanctuary hummed with life, the soft word of evening feeders, the distant sound of cars leaving the parking area, and the peaceful settling of animals for the night. Grace felt a deep sense of peace wash over her as she sat with Valor under the ancient trees. This place, once teetering on the brink of loss, now stood as a beacon of hope for both animals and people. They had built something truly special here, something that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. If you enjoyed the story of Grace, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.